Greetings and welcome. My name is Winton Goodrich. I'm the Superintendent of Schools for the Franklin Northwest Supervisory Union. With me today is the esteemed Terry O'Shea. Terry wears two hats today. Formally, and we'll talk more about it as we move through the show. Terry is a consultant that is working statewide in lots of different arenas, but not as much in education, and came with a very high recommendation as far as a facilitator of an Act 46 study, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And again, I'll share more about that as we get into this show. Act 46, lots of people have heard lots about it. Act 46 is really a continuation of a dialogue that's been happening in legislature for at least the last 10 years, if not more. It started way back with the Wallace Foundation, put up $7,000 for school districts to study how they could become more efficient. And again, it's based on a cost factor as well as quality. And again, there was an assumption that Vermont is very decentralized in how school boards operate. And so when we talk about the word of governance and governance study, governance is really about the relationship between school boards, administrators, and teachers and the public. So the governance study looked at the fact that in Franklin Northwest we have 25 school board members, we have 5 local boards, and we have a supervisory union board. And so the discussion is about, could we do this job with a single board that now 6 boards operate? And so that's really the crux of what this Act 46 merger legislation was about. Would that make some sense across the state to take the 60 entities and to turn them into, rather than multiple school boards in each SU, to turn them into a single school board? And so the assumption by legislature is that that would be a better way to go. We're not so sure in Franklin Northwest that that's what we think is best for education. And that's the focus of our show today. Before we go into that, beyond the background of Franklin Northwest, our neighbors to the south in St. Albans City, St. Albans Town, BFA, and Fairfield had a different assumption, and they did a merger that's now called Maple Run. And we're sitting in their domain today with a studio in St. Albans. And we're coming to you with a bit of background information that would help you to better understand for voters in Franklin, in Highgate, at Swanton, and at Sheldon, who will be voting next Tuesday, or Tuesday, November 7th, will be voting on whether or not they support the recommendations that have emerged from the study committee, of which Terry facilitated, and of the school boards that came together and have supported the recommendation of the study committee. And the focus of the vote next Tuesday will be if voters feel that the recommendations are the way they'd like to go, and you vote yes, it means you support the work of the committee and the vision of the boards. So if you vote no, it means you'd like to go back to the drawing board and look differently about potentially merging and giving up that local control. Again, that vote is Tuesday. I'm going to say it a couple of times today because I think it's important. In Franklin, Highgate, and in Sheldon, those will be floor votes, like town meeting votes, where you come together, you get information about the topic, and then probably cast a paper ballot if that's how it goes. In Swanton, it's an Australian ballot. You know, we're bringing in foreigners here. They got to tell us how to operate this. But an Australian ballot is from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And what that means is you go to the polls at the village center, and the ballot will be there for you to either vote yes or no that you support or not. The other piece we'll talk about in more detail is we've decided that because Missisquoi Valley Union School has a capital reserve fund, and over the years that capital reserve fund had different purposes and different names, that in order to fully utilize the $520,000 that's in there to repair roofs and paving and take care of the infrastructure of the facility, we just need to have a clarification of language and make sure that it's all legal. So that's a fairly simplistic vote, and it is not a money vote. It's just about should we have the language consistent with what law is so that the board can use that over the next 5 years. So with that, that's kind of where we're going. I'm going to introduce again Terry.
Hello.
And we brought Terry into this because she had a very good reputation for, as a consultant, as a facilitator, to help us with the independent study and a bit more kind of backstory. The boards early on, 2 years ago, jumped into an initial study. It was a $5,000 study, and it was paid for by state funds. And the boards and the community members who came to information meetings were not particularly enamored with the outcome of that study and really felt like it was teeing it up that in order to use state money to move forward, you had to agree to a merger process, and then the study just took you down that path of merging. And what the board said, we'd rather use our own money and have it be totally independent, and we want an independent facilitator to help guide us. And that's when we got connected with Terry, who's been a long-standing resident and parent of children that went through our school districts in Swanton and at MVU. And she's with us to do that work, and we're happy to have her here today.
Thank you, Wynn. And it was a great pleasure to work with you all and the committee. And I did want to just say something, if you don't mind, because I know it's one of the first things we're going to talk about in terms of more about Act 46 and the law, because sometimes I think people think it's just about boards merging, and that's kind of the simple part. Like that's probably the most visible thing right now, or the most immediate. But it actually is so much more than that, isn't it?
Yeah,
and we'll get to more of the details as we go through here.
Yeah.
But thank you, Wynn, for that introduction.
Yeah. So Terry and I are just going to kind of have back and forth dialogue here about what happened and how we initially started this, and maybe it makes sense to identify that there was a board member representative from each of the 5 boards, which includes MVU. MVU, in a sense, and I say this figuratively, doesn't really have a direct dog in the fight because MVU doesn't vote on this. They're voting on their capital reserve fund. It's really the local municipalities that vote, and again, those local municipalities are Franklin, Highgate, Sheldon, and Swanton. And so those are the communities that will be asking citizens to come together on November 7th to learn more about it and to vote whether or not to support the recommendations of the board.
Right, and in Swanton, November 2nd is the informational meeting.
That's a good point.
So throw that in for advertising.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, November 7th in all of the various districts. Yeah. Hopefully we're getting the information out there and the education out there so people know. But anyway.
So start, Terry, as you came into this, maybe start with what your observations were, what your challenge was. And I just want to be very transparent here. Terry came in as a hired facilitator with local funds, and she was enjoying it so much that she decided at the late hour in Swanton, when there was no board candidate that emerged, that she would be a write-in candidate. And at that point, we stopped paying her.
Right. And
from there on out, she facilitated at no charge the duration of the study process, and more than met our expectations for the thoroughness of the study, of which you can find on websites at the schools or at the SU, the full 76-page document. And also you can find a synopsis of that that's more like some 10 pages or so that just gives kind of the executive summary and some of the key information. You also around town might see the green trifolds. This is a product of Terry's good work as well, that kind of boils it down into, one page. What does a yes vote mean? What does a no vote mean? A little bit about Act 46, and so on and so forth. So you'll see those around town, and you'll see those on the website as well. So if you want the quick and short version, you go to this if you want kind of the in-between. It's kind of like the three bears and, one's too much, one's not enough, and one's just right. Well, this is probably the just right one, which is the modified executive summary, and it gives that background. So maybe,
or the 76-page one, yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good idea, because when Wynn first reached out to me about doing this, I was like, I'm not sure, that I know. And then I met the people, and it was something that I definitely wanted to do. And also, I really remember the group being really clear with me that they wanted to do what was best for the communities and for the children, and that they would be open to whatever we found in the data. And so probably we should mention who was on that committee, because they spent a lot of hours, days, times, months, probably, when we add it all together. So from Swanton, it was Toby McGuire. From Franklin, it was Bob Berger, who chaired the committee. And previously for MVU, from Franklin, was Bob Irish, who was on it too. And then from Sheldon, it's Jason O'Connell. McConnell, yes. Sorry. Okay, and who are we forgetting?
Don Collins came in when Bob Irish stepped down.
For MVU. And then, of course, Connie Bior for Highgate. And Wynn, who was there throughout, too. And Channel 15, who's been there, too. So, and we got everybody right.
Yeah, and we might add that an interested citizen, Jay Deneau, followed every one of the meetings, came to them religiously, and also helped gather some outside external information as well. And so much appreciation to the committee that worked for a good year and a half, about every 2 weeks. And this wasn't a once a month. This was this was digging down deep into really what's the purpose of education, how do we deliver it. In fact, I'll always remember what Connie Bior's statement was after a night of kind of one topic and really drilling down into the education system, saying we ought to be having these kinds of conversations regardless if Act 46 requires us to do it. And we made a commitment at that time to continue the work of this Act 46 committee. We probably have a different name. I think we've heard Act 46 enough. And by the way, legislature, and this is in due respect, they come up with a different name every year. So it started as Act 46. This last legislative session, it moved to Act 49, but it really started with Act 153. And prior to that, after that, it was Act 156. So it's hard to keep up with this if you're not intimately involved with kind of the day-to-day jargon that happens. But the bottom line is it's about how do we deliver in the most efficient way the best education that the community can afford. So it's about cost and quality, and we looked at both.
Right, thank you, that's good. And then I think it's important because it was actually the second committee that was formed, as Wynn referenced, and that the first committee that they went out and they talked to all the citizens in the towns about what their concerns were, what they wanted, things like that. So the committee members on the committee that we're talking about now, they had that input from before about how strongly their voters felt about not merging and keeping their school board and keeping their school, et cetera. Because so there was that input, but they were still going to be neutral depending on data. So we did look at lots of data. We looked at qualitative data and we looked at quantitative data. We looked at a ton of data. And that's kind of where Wynn was saying, as we were looking at all this data, we were like, well, this is good to be looking at all this data. Regardless of how much time it takes, it's still a good thing. And so qualitative, maybe that's where to start with this. Or maybe let's talk a little bit more about Act 46 if we could. Just what it really means.
The 5 goals probably make sense. And so you'll see in the documents that, again, you can access on websites. And these Act 46 goals are required of every school district in Vermont, not just ours. But it's really about provide substantial equity in the quality and variety of education opportunities, lead students to achieve or exceed the state education quality standards. And I'll just stop there and say the Agency of Ed, starting this year and over the next 2 years, will visit with a visiting team every school district and every SU in Vermont to be able to ascertain whether or not students are achieving some very high-reaching quality standards. The third is maximize operational efficiencies through increased flexibility to manage, share, and transfer resources. In that context, always looking at student-teacher ratios as well. The fourth goal, promote transparency and accountability. And the fifth is to deliver education at a cost that parents, voters, and taxpayers value. And therein lies the crux of its quality and affordability all at the same time.
Right. And so the committee kept those goals in mind as we went through, and we framed things through those goals. And so Act 46 was kind of brought about we were not the poster child, as we say before, for Act 46, our Franklin Northwest Supervisory Union. Because Act 46 really came about because of declining enrollment, the cost per pupil being so high. What else was it that drove it? There was...
Well, transparency is a piece.
And also the quality of education, because some of those small schools, there's a lot of supervisory unions with less than 100 students in them, right?
School districts with less than 100.
School districts with less than 100. And so there were concerns about quality of education, or that they were getting the same offerings, whether there was equity or not.
Yep, exactly right.
So that was huge. And then but in our situation, populations were not declining like they were on the state.
Right.
We did have MVU is declining, but not at the same rate as high schools in the state. Mm-hmm. And we also had a lot of sharing of resources already. And the most visible probably being MVU. I mean, we'd already come together, our high schools. Now Sheldon has free choice, and so that's different. They would be treated differently under the law too.
And let me push a little bit on what Terry said about, we already had the experience that started in 1970 when Franklin, Highgate, and Swanton agreed to create a union middle and high school, which is MVU. Right. And so we have experience with that. We had that merger that happened starting really back in the Hoff governor era of the 1960s when there were 36 union schools created. It took MVU a few more years to be able to come to that agreement, and a few promises that got delivered at a much later time. But the recognition in the 60s, it was a similar kind of dynamic as now. And if we were to take it back to the early 1900s, there were 2,500 schools in the early 1900s. And that's when supervisory unions first came into being. There was a Harvard group of 10 individuals that were hired by the state of Vermont to really look at our education system. And this is really the equity component that prevails today, realizing that the little one-room schoolhouses had great disparity in the quality of education that was provided for children. And at that point, 14 supervisory unions were created, really one per county, and a superintendent was hired to oversee and to ensure that there was quality that was being delivered in each of those schools. And about that time, a pretty dramatic decline in the number of schools that went from 2,500 in the late 1800s to about 350 in the early 1900s. And right now, today, we're looking at a bit over 300 schools. So the number of schools are not going to diminish. It's not the intent of Act 46 to close schools. The intent is for them to be able to share resources in a more efficient and effective manner. So that's a little bit of kind of past
that's
history.
That's a lot of information, you know all that. Yeah. So, and that brings us to another point, and that is that we already share in our supervisory union. And Wynn, you really have, under great leadership with Wynn, that there's shared teachers, there's agreed upon contracts that we share. Yep. I mean, all those efficiencies that some supervisory unions are getting by merging, we already have.
Yep. And this is really an enhanced, I'm probably getting ahead of myself.
I know.
The state in Act 46 had what are called preferred governance models, and that's what Maple Run did. The preferred model, if all being equal and the districts have the similar governance structure, the preferred model is to dissolve the small boards and create one big board. Franklin Northwest didn't choose to move forward with the preferred model for a couple of reasons. But one of them, Sheldon is a pre-K 8, Franklin, Highgate, and Swanton are pre-K 6.
Yeah.
You can't force mergers of unlike governance structures. MVU is a grade 7 through 12. So one of the preferred structures could be what is MVU now, could potentially, and the state still could do this, could merge Franklin, Highgate, and Swanton with MVU and create one pre-K through 12 school board. Sheldon would be a standalone. I think if one were to kind of step back and look at Franklin County, knowing that there's a merger process going on in Franklin Northeast, and the merger process north of us is Richford and Montgomery. Will be voting on November 30th to merge those two pre-K through 12 boards into a single board in what's called a side-by-side. And one side of that is Enosburg and Richford, having merged the two pre-K 12s together. The other side would be Berkshire, Montgomery, and Bakersfield, merging their three pre-K 8 districts together. And so they did a pretty serious study at a very late hour. Montgomery is an advisory member, so if the voters from Montgomery choose not to join that, then it doesn't prevent Berkshire and Bakersfield from creating a single board. There is flexibility in that plan that Sheldon could, as a like pre-K 8 entity, could merge with them, and that would pull Sheldon out of Franklin Northwest. We probably should have brought a little geography map here so that folks could see physically what that might look like.
But how that relates to our supervisory union, I think a couple of things. Well, first of all, when we talk about merging the school boards, we're also talking about merging budgets. And so if we go back to some of the constraints that people had in, like, for example, Franklin, if they merge budgets, their cost per pupil goes much higher if we're merged. The same with Highgate, their cost per pupil, not much, but it'll go higher. And same with MVU. So that will affect their taxes.
Right.
And it also affects not only the cost that's involved, it's also the control. And their people and their community really felt strongly that they wanted to keep local control. Now, the other thing that we didn't talk about, part of this that gets taken, so of course when you merge the districts, you're also merging budgets. And when you merge budgets, there was also part of the law that you have representation based on population.
Right.
And so that was another big drawback for the people in our communities. However, there has, like Franklin Northeast, right? They've talked about how they're going to do at-large representation. So
which is what we have at MVU now. MVU has at-large voting.
So it could have worked with that if but they still, the other thing is none of the schools receive small school grants or phantom pupils.
Yeah.
So there weren't those incentives for joining. And you can
I'll talk a little bit about
time.
that. Let's go back just for a moment to the voting process. In Maple Run, our neighbors to the south, Maple Run it's really a constitutional provision, and all schools are required to do this. It's one person, one vote, and the more people you have in your town, the more voting power you're going to have on that board. So in our situation, Franklin is the smallest of them all. Swanton is the largest. Highgate and Sheldon are kind of in between at about 300 or so students each. Franklin about 100 plus, and MVU at 800 plus. What it would mean is the biggest town has more power.
Right.
At-large voting, the way you get around one person, one vote is you allow every town to vote for every board member. And MVU has been doing that since 1970, although the constitutional provision came in the late 80s that required that. MVU just agreed to do it before the constitutional law forced that to happen. So there is a way to be able to do it, but the long and the short of it is, in Maple Run, Fairfield has 2 board members on that board, but they each carry only half vote each. So the representative vote is 1 vote on a board of, I think, 10 or 11. And so one could say, if you think about it in a parochial manner, Fairfield doesn't have much voting power. the reality of boards that have been in place for a long time at the union level, constituents don't generally think only about their town.
Right.
These are all our kids, and we're voting for what's in the best interest of all children.
Right.
And that, again, is a premise in Act 46, although it's hard for folks that are used to the traditional method to be able to see that and have an open mind about how that would work.
But we do in Franklin Northwest, we have experience with that because of MVU. And so Highgate, Franklin, and Swanton are very close in terms of understanding that. And Sheldon is a great partner with us too that we have.
Right.
So I don't want to jump ahead, but I would say this. So you can see that Franklin, who has great test scores too, and won a lot of honors, that their vote on this committee, which was equal representation, would be that we not follow, that we go ahead and look at with a neutral party, myself being facilitator, as opposed to going with a state and looking towards the merger route. Highgate was pretty similar too, and they were basing this based on input that they'd received from their community earlier, and same as Sheldon. Now Swanton was a little different, because Swanton would stand to gain a lot probably, being the biggest, the largest population, and that the most expensive cost per pupil rating, which would go down. So the Swanton representative was more or less, okay, maybe we should go the other route. But then, as time was going by, it was realized, you're part of a union. And if you don't have other dance partners, you have to do what's best for everyone. And so it was best for everyone in this situation was to follow this neutral path until they could figure out what was best.
And let me just talk a bit about dance partners. Is a figure of speech that we often use. Act 46 required not only you look at your partners within your supervisory union, but also to look outside those boundaries. And so we did. We looked at Alberg, we looked at Bakersfield, we actually went to their board meetings. They came to our board meetings. We had a conversation about, does it make sense, even though there's a lot of geography in between, because we initially were looking at should we merge, because there are tax incentives if there's a merger. And so that's the other piece of the conversation in this deliberation. Do we, for either 4 or 5 years, have some reduced tax rates in our towns? That was I call it the honey and the hammer. The honey was that you get reduced tax savings if you merge. The hammer is if you don't merge, you'll likely get merged by the state board. And going back to Terry's initial comment about phantom students, phantom students were, and again, Franklin Northwest is not a poster child for Act 46 per se, because we don't have such dramatic decline in enrollment, but every student that comes to the school brings state aid or state revenue to the tune of $13,000 or $14,000 that the state pays back the cost per pupil. And when you have fewer students, you have less revenue. And if that over a long period of time, we lose a lot of students, we have much less budget money to be able to operate on. The state, though, in the revenue reimbursement, doesn't, even if MVU's enrollment dropped by 10% this year, it's 80 kids, if it dropped 10%, the state's still going to pay us as if it dropped no more than 3.5%. And so if that happens over a number of years, before you know it, you're getting revenue for students that aren't there. Act 46 takes away the phantom students. So it forces districts to deal with the reality of how many students they really have.
Right.
The small schools grants for schools under 120 students, there's an additional amount that the state education fund would pay to those districts to be able to kind of bolster the budget if there were operating expenses that were hard to meet because of fluctuations. So Franklin Northwest doesn't have either of those dynamics, and that's part of the hammer. If you take away that financial support, it may force districts to do things they don't really want to do.
Right.
So that's the honey and the hammer.
Just so I think it's the transparency too in terms of the honey, is that we did run numerous calculations on what would happen if we did get those incentives, how would the taxes be affected?
Yeah.
Because, we were soon enough to get the 8 cents, then the 6 cents, then the 4 cents, and the 2 cents. So we could have gotten the 4 years. And when we did those taxes, even with the 8 cent incentive, I think there was one year where Franklin would get like a minus 2 cents. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the years, they were going to be paying more.
Yeah.
And Highgate went down a little some years, but their cost per pupil went up. And Swanton, though, would have seen tax benefits,
Yep.
which is why, the Swanton is kind of a tricky piece of this puzzle. However, again, we're part of MVU. We're part of a
bigger entity.
A bigger entity right now.
Yep.
So you have to look at everyone and what's best for everyone is what the committee all decided there.
And really, it's a long-range vision.
Exactly.
It would be easy to be lulled into that on the short term. It would be an advantage for taxpayers to move in this direction.
Right.
The reality is, when you come out at the end of 4 years, where are we?
Right.
And the harsh reality is Franklin's cost per pupil would increase more than $1,000 per child, and that's a substantial impact on that community.
Right.
Again, they have high test scores and low cost, as our other districts have also very low cost per pupil compared to the rest of the state.
Exactly. That's important to talk about too, compared to the rest of the state. And there was something else I wanted to mention, and for some reason it just slipped my mind.
Well,
I know. When we looked at some of the qualitative information, we found that a lot of these, Franklin, Highgate, Sheldon, they use their school for so many meetings. They don't have the municipal complex that we have in Swanton, where so a lot of what they do takes place in the school, a lot of their identity as a community. Mm-hmm. And Swanton, too, a lot of our identity takes place in that school. Mm-hmm. And like you said, long term.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's important to stress that they wouldn't lose that identity per se. However, there's the worry of encroachment that when you lose your board, you begin to lose the nexus or the focus within your community, and especially with very small schools. That's in Franklin. That's what that community is really about. The school is a prized possession. Yeah. There are folks that fear that if there were one board and the enrollments continue to decline, that Franklin School might be closed down the road. And once you give up that local control, it's hard to get it back. And so, that statement is part of the independence that we really looked at without
Right.
allowing bias to cause us to be only in one direction. And again, that was the impetus initially for doing the independent study and for bringing in Terry to be able to lead us without the bias that we need to merge. So as we're kind of coming to some closure on this before we go into the MVU side, Terry, talk a little bit about some of the numbers that the committee came up with as far as cost per pupil, beyond what we've already said, and also the qualitative things. What were some of the recommendations?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Maybe because we're running a little short on time, you can find tax information in those, rather than me spewing it off right now, you can find it in that form, in this medium-sized one. But I think it's really important to think about what will change. The committee is very committed to all the students and the communities within Franklin Northwest Supervisory Union, and came up with quite a few additions, enhancements, et cetera, things that, continuous improvement right now. The schools they've known that they need, Franklin's doing great test-wise, but the other schools know that the test scores could do better. And so the schools have been working on it, and really hard. And so what we've talked about is, okay, how can we as a overall union help every one of those schools get better test scores? And so there's certain practices, best practices, and we've already seen an example from Swanton of some of the things that they're doing for best practices. So that's one of the recommendations. There's a lot more recommendations in terms of a State of the Union, where some of the work that we've been doing on this committee, some of the data mining that we've been doing, gives us some fascinating information that we can still be looking at as we go forward. The continuous improvement teams, the writing things into processes and procedures, the continuing to look for efficiencies,
We looked at, and we're moving forward. We haven't made a final decision yet, but let's just say we're leaning towards part of the enhanced governance structure is to offer a limited elementary school choice.
Yes.
And what that means, at least for right now, is 5 students could move between any of our 4 elementary schools. I've got 3 examples right now that I'm not going to go into detail, where parents have come to us to say, this would be very helpful in our process about relocating if our children could attend XYZ school. And every one of the elementary schools is involved with this.
Yeah.
And with that kind of flexibility, our mantra is to think merged, but to act local.
That's true.
And so you can either do it through centralized one-board governance mergers, or you can do it through flexible collaborative thinking, as is our proposal, and do it in a different way with the existing governance structure. We've been for a number of years now going after high school tuition students.
Yes.
We send a bus to Sheldon. We send a bus to Alberg. We bring in probably close to 40 students at the high school level. So if you have a decline in enrollment in the high school, you can either cut programs or you can go after revenue. And we offer some very good program opportunities at MVU. And so that's one of the reasons that we're doing that. I was supposed to be in China this week,
yes,
doing the same thing there with an international student recruitment process to be able to bring Chinese students into MVU and also into elementary schools. So there's some other things that are in the works on developing kind of family relationships. Those are tuition-paying students, and the process would be for host families to provide room and board that would be paid for by foreign students, much like what private schools do. So I guess if you can't beat them, you can join them.
It's pretty exciting. And the other thing I want to mention is about curriculum. There's been a great emphasis on curriculum too, and making sure that there's equity throughout the system. And that's, I think, the committee did talk about how that was great, because what we did as part of a committee process was look at the time spent on each subject in all the different schools, which mined some great data for us to use and for Libby to have. And then the next step, as Connie, making sure it's implemented, that the same kind of...
Right, with fidelity
right.
in all schools, that all students have the same opportunity to be able to learn at high levels. And we have some great initiatives that have been going on now for 2, 3, and 4 years that are just starting to show results with some international consultants that are kind of the best in the land.
Yeah.
We're very proud to are moving in that direction, and we're using grant dollars, federal grant dollars, to be able to pay for them, again, so that we can all be on the same page. So again, it's act merged, remain local is our mantra. What I'm going to do is kind of bring us to some closure on the mechanics of what the vote is. And I said earlier in the program, next Tuesday, voters in Franklin, Highgate, and Sheldon at 7 o'clock at night will come together, and we'll vote on, have the information meeting, a floor vote and a floor conversation about whether or not to support the recommendations of the committee, which were supported by the local boards and the supervisory union board.
Right.
If voters vote yes at those floor meetings, it means they are agreeing to support the recommendation that will then go to the State Board of Ed, and the State Board of Ed will hear our advocacy to remain the same. If the State Board believes that meets the 5 goals of Act 46, then they don't merge us. If they don't believe that we're providing them with the adequate support for education, then they have the power to merge all of our boards together. At the same time that the Act 46, and the Swanton is the same, except you want to talk about that that's not a floor vote.
Oh, right, the Australian ballot in Swanton from 7 to 7.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, for Swanton, Highgate, and Franklin citizens, all day long will be an Australian ballot vote for the MVU Capital Reserve Fund, and that's on the back page of this green flyer. And what it says is that the MVU ballot vote for Capital Reserve Fund language update will be in those 3 towns, and that's 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. So your strategy might be to come around 6:30ish to get that vote done in an Australian ballot in those communities, and then stay in Franklin, Highgate, and Swanton Franklin, Highgate, and Sheldon for the evening votes on Act 46. So the daytime voting is MVU Capital Reserve Fund. And again, that is about correcting some language. It's not that it violates any law, it's just that it needs to be consistent. And right now the language has not been consistent over the last probably 15 years. And it's to create a single focus that the money that voters set aside to take care of our buildings at MVU had different names. And we just need to have clarity in what that direction is. And by law, again, there's $520,000 in that Capital Reserve Fund to be able to keep the building operational and to keep it looking good and effective for what the needs of children are. So that's really the nature of what our show is today. Terry, we've got about 4 minutes here. Anything that we missed in the process that we ought to talk about?
I'm wondering. I will say this, that I did come into this neutral, and I was so impressed with the work of our supervisory union. The people in it and the work, and also the excitement of what's going to happen further.
Yeah.
But that's why I did agree to, be neutral now as a facilitator, but also put on a different hat as a Swanton board member.
Yeah, that's a tough balance, isn't it?
It has been a tough balance, but truly, it is what's best for everyone.
Yes.
And that's why the committee is making this recommendation.
Yeah.
And we do work well together already.
Yes, we do.
Which makes a huge, significant impetus for us to be able to work even better, enhancing things for students and communities. How about you, Wynn? You're the one that's been helping with all this. What do you have to say?
Well, I think we pretty much said it all. It's really about 2 ways to get the job done. One is through merging, and one is through an alternative governance structure. We call it an enhanced alternative governance structure because it's not just doing what we've been doing. We're ramping it up by going after additional students, which is additional revenue. We're operating like a single district in that we allow teachers and staff members to be employed in a number of districts within our SU and even outside our SU. And the elementary choice, we're allowing that free flow, very much like what Maple Run. Maple Run has 10 students in and 10 students out. For many years in high schools, it's called Act 129. There's that act again.
I know, and you know them all.
Act 129 really allows high school choice. And so that means BFA students up to 20 a year could attend MVU or Richford or Enosburg, and vice versa, any of those schools. And there is movement for many different reasons. And so it really comes down to what is within the value structure of the communities.
Yes.
And our communities and our boards have chosen to remain more like we were than we are to give up that local autonomy and that local control that has been it's been vested in communities for the last 200 years. And we think that we can accomplish those 5 goals by acting merged and staying local.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
And that is the committee, though, is respectful of what the communities think. And just to make sure, that's why we're having this referendum,
Right.
to get input. So if people don't agree, if they believe that merger is the way to go, then let us know by voting no
Yeah.
and not supporting.
Yeah.
If you do approve, then let us know as well by voting.
By voting yes.
Yes.
So that's really that's a good swan song for the end of the show. And speaking of that, we only have one swan now, so that's a very sad tale. But that's a story for another day.
Another day. Thank you, Will.
The single swan actually will be residing at MVU this winter.
I know. I love that. That's a
Yeah.
great idea.
And we were hoping for 2, but we'll glad to have 1.
But the students will do a great job of taking care of
That's
the
it.
swan.
So thank you for tuning in. Again, the vote is next Tuesday,
Yes.
November 7th. From there, The boards will go to the state board in January and will advocate for staying an enhanced alternative governance structure. And from there, over the next year, we'll find out whether the state board decides if they want to merge us or if they believe that we're able to get it done in this new structure.
And with input from the community.
Exactly right. So
Thank
thank you,
you.
Terry, for
Wynn.
being with us today. And thank you, viewers. And we'd love to see you at the polls next Tuesday.